Sunday morning, August 18th, arrived with the kind of bright, cruel sunlight that seemed to mock fear. 19-year-old Fumiko Tanaka pressed her spine against the sun-warmed wood of the barracks wall, heart slamming against ribs like a trapped bird. The Mississippi heat wrapped around her throat thick and wet, making it hard to breathe. Across the dusty courtyard, through waves of heat rising from red clay, she watched her former commanding officer walk toward them. His prisoner uniform, faded in army green with the letters POWs stenciled across the back, did nothing to diminish the authority carved into every step. His posture was parade ground perfect. His face was stone. His eyes held the weight of absolute certainty. Around Fumiko, 30 Japanese women began to scream. Not screams of pain, not screams of surprise, screams of recognition, of understanding what was about to happen. The sound cut through the humid air like broken glass, high-pitched and desperate, filled with terror that transcended language. Some women dropped to their knees. Others clutched each other, bodies trembling so violently they could barely stand. A girl to Fumiko's left collapsed entirely, curling into herself, hands covering her head as if she could make herself disappear. Fumiko stood frozen, watching Ishikawa advance. 20 feet away. 15. Each step deliberate. Each step bringing him closer to judgment she had spent 4 months trying to escape. Then the American soldiers moved. Sergeant Thomas Webb, broad-shouldered Georgia farm boy, who had spent 3 years fighting Japanese forces across the Pacific, planted himself directly in Ishikawa's path. 6'2", 195 pounds of muscle earned from farm work and war. 4 other guards flanked him, forming a line. A barrier, a wall between the advancing Japanese officer and the terrified women. They held their rifles angled across their chests, not aimed at anyone, not threatening, but immovable. Webb spoke first in English, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had made his decision. "That's far enough, Lieutenant." Then in broken Japanese, he had learned specifically for moments like this, practiced until the words came without thinking. "Dame Hikama-san, no, you cannot go." Fumiko stopped breathing. The enemy was shielding them from their own people. The Americans who should have been their destroyers were protecting them from their commanders. The men who wore the same uniform she once wore. The men who represented everything she had been taught to honor and obey. In that frozen moment, with Mississippi sun beating down and women's screams still echoing off barracks walls, Fumiko understood something that shattered every belief she had carried across the Pacific. Everything she had been taught about this war was backwards. 3 months earlier, Fumiko Tanaka had been on Okinawa when the world ended. April 1st, 1945. Communications bunker, southern Okinawa. 0847 hours. She had been 19 years old for exactly 2 weeks when the American artillery turned morning into thunder. Fumiko sat at her radio station, headphones pressed tight against her ears, logging frequency changes in the communications ledger. The bunker smelled of cigarette smoke and damp concrete, and the peculiar electrical scent of radio equipment running hot. Outside, she could hear birds singing. Spring morning. Almost peaceful. The first shell hit at 0847 hours exactly. She knew because she had just written the time in her log. The explosion was not a sound. It was a physical force that punched through walls and threw her sideways out of her chair. The ceiling buckled. Concrete dust choked the air so thick she could not see her own hands. Someone was screaming. She realized it was her. Captain Yamamoto, her uncle, the man who had raised her after her parents died in a factory fire when she was 14, shouted orders that made no sense because there was nowhere to go. The bunker was supposed to be safe. The bunker was reinforced concrete 3 feet thick. The second shell proved that 3 feet was not enough. The wall cracked like an egg. Sunlight streamed through the fissure, illuminating dust that hung in the air like fog. Through the map, Fumiko could see the street outside. Buildings burning, civilians running, American tanks rolling forward with terrible mechanical precision. 20 minutes later, standing in that rubble-filled street with 29 other women from the communications unit, Captain Yamamoto placed a small glass vial in Fumiko's palm. The cyanide capsule felt impossibly heavy for something so small. "Do not let them take you alive, Fumiko-chan," her uncle said. His voice was gentle, loving. The same voice he had used to teach her how to operate a radio, how to identify aircraft by engine sound, how to serve with honor. "The Americans are demons. They will do unspeakable things to you. Death is mercy. Death is honor." Fumiko had heard the stories. Every woman in the Japanese military had heard them. Stories of rape and torture and degradation so terrible that death was genuinely preferable. Stories told with such specific horror that her imagination filled in details every night, keeping her awake in the dark. The propaganda had been thorough. The propaganda had been effective. The propaganda had prepared them for this exact moment. Take the capsule rather than surrender. Choose death over dishonor. This was the code. This was duty. Fumiko closed her fist around the vial. The glass was warm from her uncle's hand. She nodded, said the only thing she could say. I understand. But when the American soldier burst through the doorway 10 minutes later, when his rifle swung toward her and his young face twisted with adrenaline and fear, when his voice cracked as he shouted in terrible Japanese, Te wo agero, hands up, Fumiko's hand would not move. Her fingers refused to unscrew the capsule. She stood frozen in that doorway, dust settling around her explosions still echoing in the distance. The American private could not have been older than 22. Blonde hair beneath his helmet, blue eyes wide with the same terror she felt. He should have shot her. Everything she had been taught said he would shoot her. He did not shoot her. Hands up, he shouted again. His voice cracked on the second word. Not with aggression, with fear. He was as scared as she was. Fumiko raised her hands, slowly. The capsule still clutched in her right palm, hidden from view. The private gestured with his rifle barrel. Walk outside. Now. That was all. No vigilansum. No degradation. No unspeakable horrors. Just walk outside. In the street under smoke-darkened sky, Fumiko found 30 other women from various units, all huddled together under American guard. Some were crying. Others stood in shocked silence, faces blank but eyes screaming. An American medic moved among them, a young man with Red Cross armband and a canvas bag full of supplies. He was checking injuries, offering water from a metal canteen, water from the enemy. When he reached Fumiko, he held out the canteen, said something in English she did not understand. His tone was gentle. She was too thirsty to refuse, too thirsty to remember that accepting anything from the enemy was collaboration, too thirsty to do anything but take the canteen with shaking hands and drink. The water was clean and cold. It tasted like metal and salvation. Fumiko drank and tried not to think about what it meant that the Americans were giving her water instead of death. Tried not to think about the capsule still hidden in her palm. Tried not to think about the fact that she had failed. Her duty, failed her honor, failed everything she had been taught. She had survived when she should have died. And the Americans were treating her like a human being. They were loaded onto trucks within the hour. Canvas-covered military vehicles that smelled of diesel and dust. The trucks drove north through devastated countryside, past burning villages, past bodies in ditches, past the wreckage of war. At the coast, American ships waited. Massive gray vessels with numbers painted on their hulls and guns bristling from every angle. The gangway seemed impossibly steep as Fumiko climbed aboard, hands still shaking capsule now tucked into the pocket of her torn uniform. Around her, women whispered prayers to gods they half believed in. Prayers that death would come quickly if it had to come. Prayers that the end would be merciful. But death did not come. Instead came seasickness. The roll of waves beneath steel hull. The smell of diesel fuel and salt water and paint. And food. Rice, yes. But also meat, bread, canned fruit, condensed milk for coffee. The mess attendant placed a tray in front of Fumiko that first evening aboard ship. She stared at it, unable to process what she was seeing. It was more food than she had seen in 6 months. It's poisoned, whispered Hana, the field nurse who sat beside her. Hana was 23, sharp, featured with eyes that had seen too much. They will kill us slowly, weaken our resolve before interrogation. Other women nodded, made sense. Of course it made sense. Why else would the enemy feed prisoners? But as hours passed and no one died as the sun set and rose and set again, and still no one showed signs of poisoning, hunger won over fear. Fumiko ate. The pork tasted rich, almost overwhelming, after months of watery gruel that barely qualified as food. The bread dissolved on her tongue, soft and impossibly white. The canned peaches were so sweet she almost cried. She had forgotten sweetness could exist in the world. The voyage lasted 2 weeks, 14 days crossing Pacific waters, sailing east toward a country Fumiko knew only through propaganda. America, they had been told, was a land of demons, a nation of barbarians who valued nothing but money and violence. A place where people lived without honor, without discipline, without the spiritual purity that defined Japanese civilization. Yet the soldiers guarding them seemed mostly bored and tired. They played cards during breaks, shared cigarettes, argued about something called baseball in voices that carried no malice. Some were young, barely older than Fumiko herself. They looked like exhausted boys in uniform. They did not look like demons. One guard, a private with freckles and red hair, smiled at Fumiko once when their eyes met across the deck. Not a predatory smile, just acknowledgement, human to human. He was perhaps 20 years old, This created a fracture in Fumiko's understanding. Not a break, not yet, but a crack. If Americans were demons, why did they look so ordinary? If they were barbarians, why had they given her water and food and let her live? On the 10th day of the voyage, Fumiko stood on deck during evening exercise period, watching the sun set over endless ocean. Beside her, a woman named Sachiko spoke quietly. Sachiko had been a school teacher in Tokyo before the war. 28 years old, university-educated intellectual in a way that made other women uncomfortable. She asked questions no one else dared ask. "What if we were lied to?" Sachiko said. Her voice was barely audible over the sound of waves against hull. "What if everything they told us about Americans was a lie?" Fumiko did not answer. Could not answer. Because if that was true, if the propaganda had been lies, then what did that make her uncle's orders to take the capsule? What did that make the code that demanded death over surrender? What did that make the war itself? The question followed Fumiko into sleep that night, into dreams where she was falling through darkness toward an answer she was not ready to face. When the ship reached San Francisco on April 15, 1945, Fumiko pressed her face against the porthole in the hold to see. The Golden Gate Bridge rose through morning fog like something from a dream that had escaped into reality. Fumiko had seen pictures of bridges. Japan had bridges. Elegant wooden structures, steel spans over rivers. But nothing had prepared her for this. Two towers of rust-red steel soared 746 feet into California sky. Suspension cables swept between them in perfect mathematical curves, supporting a roadway that stretched over a mile across the bay. The bridge was so massive it seemed to defy physics. So beautiful it seemed deliberate, as if someone had built a monument just to prove they could. "How?" Keiko whispered beside her. Keiko was 17, a farm girl from Hokkaido, who had been conscripted to work in military laundries. She had never left her village before the war, had never seen anything larger than a 2-story building. How did they build that? Behind the bridge, San Francisco gleamed in early light. Buildings intact and whole climbed hills that rolled up from the bay. Windows caught sun and threw it back in brilliant flashes. No bomb craters, no burn scars, no rubble-filled streets. The city looked like it had never been touched by war. The realization hit Fumiko like a physical blow, like the artillery shell that had destroyed her bunker. Japan had told them America was being destroyed by the war, that American cities were burning under Japanese air raids, that the American economy was collapsing the American people, the starving victory close and inevitable. But here was a city untouched, prosperous, alive in ways Japanese cities had not been alive in years, thriving with a casual abundance that made everything Japan had said seem like delusion. Sachiko stood on Fumiko's other side, staring at the city. Tears ran down her face. "We were lied to," Sachiko said. Her voice was flat, empty, about everything. They disembarked under armed guard, loaded onto army buses with mesh over the windows. As the convoy pulled away from the docks, Fumiko pressed her face to the mesh, desperate to see everything. San Francisco's streets were full of cars, not military vehicles, private automobiles. Shiny Fords and Chevrolets and Buicks, more cars than Fumiko had seen in her entire life combined. People walked on sidewalks wearing clean clothes, carrying shopping bags, looking well-fed and unconcerned. Shop windows displayed goods, abundant goods, more goods than Fumiko could identify. Restaurants advertised steaks and chops and pie in windows decorated with cheerful paint. No one looked hungry. No one looked afraid. No one looked like they were living in a nation at war. A woman in a red dress walked a small dog on a leash. A man in a business suit read a newspaper at a streetcar stop. Children played in a park, chasing each other around trees, heavy with spring leaves, their laughter carrying through the open bus windows. Normal life, peaceful life, life proceeding as if there was no war at all. Keiko started crying beside Fumiko. Not from fear this time, from understanding. "We lost," Keiko whispered. Her voice broke on the word. "We lost so badly they don't even feel it here." The buses drove south and east for 3 days. California gave way to Nevada, Nevada to Arizona, Arizona to New Mexico, New Mexico to Texas, Texas to Mississippi. Fumiko watched America scroll past like a geography lesson she had never imagined could be real. In California, endless farms stretched to horizons so distant they seemed imaginary. Irrigation systems sent water in perfect arcs over crops that covered more acreage than entire Japanese prefectures. Tractors, dozens of them, crawled across fields, leaving perfectly straight furrows. Workers picked fruit in loaded trucks that would carry abundance to cities that apparently had never heard of rationing. In Arizona, even the desert was organized. Cattle ranches with hundreds of head grazed on land that should have been too dry to support them. Water tanks caught rare rain. Highways cut straight lines through emptiness, paved and maintained. suggesting a government that had resources to invest even in places where no one lived. In Texas, the scale became overwhelming. Ranches where cattle grazed in pastures that had no visible end. Oiled derricks pumping black gold from earth that seemed to give it freely. Towns with grain elevators and railroad yards, and shops advertising everything from boots to farm equipment to new cars, always new cars, as if America could simply manufacture whatever it needed, whenever it wanted. The women fell into stunned silence. Conversations died. Even speculation ceased. What was there to say? Every mile they traveled revealed the same truth: Japan had attacked a nation so vast, so rich, so powerful, that 3 years of total war had barely made it notice. By the time the buses reached Mississippi on April 18th, Fumiko had stopped trying to reconcile propaganda with reality, had stopped trying to understand how Japan could have been so wrong about so much. The cognitive dissonance was too large. Her brain simply shut down, accepting images without processing meaning. Camp Shelby sat in pine forest south of Hattiesburg. The trees smelled of resin and earth and growing things. Mississippi heat pressed down like a warm, wet blanket, humidity so thick Fumiko felt she was breathing water. Her cotton dress issued on the ship stuck to her skin. Through the trees, she could see fences, guard towers, rows of identical wooden barracks painted Army Regulation green. An American flag snapped in humid breeze, stars and stripes vivid against blue sky. This was the end of the journey. This was where confusion would end and clarity would begin one way or another. The buses stopped. Guards ordered them out. The women filed toward a processing building in silence. And that was when one guard, an older sergeant with kind eyes, said something that made Fumiko's blood turn to ice. "Delousing," he said in halting Japanese, pointing toward a building from which steam rose in the afternoon heat. The terror returned instantly, completely erasing everything that had come before. Delousing meant showers. Showers meant being naked. Naked meant vulnerable. Vulnerable meant everything the propaganda had promised would happen to capture Japanese women. Some women began to cry. Others stood rigid, faces blank with shock, but bodies trembling. A few turned as if to run, though there was nowhere to run, to nowhere that made sense. Fumiko felt her hands start shaking. This was it. This was where the kindness ended, where the truth revealed itself. The food, the water, the lack of violence, all of it had been prologue, set up, making them comfortable before the horror began. Guards herded them toward the building, not roughly, not violently, but firmly. There would be no refusal. Fumiko walked on legs that barely held her weight. Around her, women whispered prayers and apologies and goodbyes. Inside, the building smelled of soap and steam and clean tile. Fumiko blinked, adjusting to dimmer light after Mississippi sun. Female American staff waited inside. Only women, no men. Red Cross volunteers in neat uniforms, Army nurses, civilian workers, all women. A middle-aged woman with a southern accent so thick Fumiko could barely understand her English approached with a towel and bar of soap. She smiled. Not a predatory smile, a kind smile, tired but genuine. The soap smelled of lavender. "Go ahead, honey," the woman said, gesturing toward shower stalls. Private stalls with curtains, thick white curtains that blocked every line of sight. Fumiko took the soap with numb fingers, walked to a stall, pulled the curtain closed, stood there breathing hard, trying to understand. Only female staff, private stalls, lavender soap. She turned the shower knob. Hot water poured from the shower head, actual hot water steam rising. Fumiko stood under the stream, hot clean water, washing away weeks of travel and salt and fear, and something broke inside her. Not broke like shattering, broke like a dam releasing pressure it could no longer hold. This was not cruelty. This was the opposite of cruelty. This was dignity offered to someone who had no right to expect it. This was mercy extended to an enemy who had been taught that mercy was weakness, that kindness was manipulation, that Americans were incapable of human feeling. The lavender soap made her skin smell like flowers she had seen in picture books as a child. The hot water eased muscles she had not realized were tensed in permanent fear. The privacy, the female staff, the gentleness, all of it said something she could not reconcile with everything she had been taught. You are a person. Even here, even as our prisoner. You are still a person deserving of basic dignity. And that somehow made it worse than any torture could have been. Because if America could do this, treat enemy prisoners with such fundamental humanity, what did that say about Japan's orders to take cyanide rather than surrender? What did it say about the propaganda that had promised degradation? What did it say about the entire worldview she had built her life around? Fumiko stood under that shower and understood with crystalline clarity her own country had lied to her about everything that mattered. The enemy had told her the truth through actions instead of words, and she did not know how to live with that knowledge. After showers, they received clean cotton dresses and practical canvas shoes. They were led to barracks where beds waited each with sheets and a pillow and a thin wool blanket. Basic, sparse, military in its efficiency, but clean, organized, human. Fumiko lay in her bunk that first night, listening to women whisper in darkness. "What do they want from us?" someone asked. "Why are they treating us this way?" another voice replied. No one had an answer. They had prepared for torture, for death, for violations too terrible to name. They had not prepared for clean sheets and hot water. They had not prepared for their enemy to treat them like human beings deserving of care. And tomorrow they would wake, and this would still be real, and they would have to figure out what it meant and how to survive it. Fumiko closed her eyes. The capsule was still in her pocket, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. She had not taken it, had chosen life over honor, had broken every code she had been taught. And lying here in enemy captivity, clean and fed and safe, she could not tell if she had made the right choice or the worst mistake of her life. Outside through the barracks window, Mississippi stars shone in a sky that looked exactly like the sky over Japan. The same stars, different worlds. And tomorrow she would have to figure out which world she belonged to now. The bugle call woke them at dawn. Sharp, bright notes cutting through Mississippi morning, through dreams of home and fear and confusion. Fumiko's eyes opened to unfamiliar ceiling, to the reality that yesterday had not been nightmare, but truth. She was in America. She was a prisoner. And somehow, impossibly, she had slept better than she had in months. Around her, women stirred. Some sat up immediately in military training, overriding exhaustion. Others moved slowly, reluctant to face another day of not understanding what was happening to them. Guards called them to formation outside, not harshly, with the same efficient neutrality they had shown yesterday. The women filed into lines, blinking in early light, and got their first full daylight view of Camp Shelby. The compound was enormous. Rows of identical barracks stretched in every direction, hundreds of them, painted the same army green, organized in perfect grid. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, manned by soldiers who watched without malice. Beyond the fence, pine forests stretched toward horizons. And in the distance, they could hear voices, male voices, American soldiers in training, singing marching cadences that carried across the morning air. This was not just a prison camp. This was an active military training facility. Tens of thousands of American soldiers preparing for war, learning to fight, learning to kill. And somewhere in this vast machine, 30 Japanese women were being held and fed and treated with incomprehensible gentleness. They were marched to the mess hall. The building smelled of coffee and frying meat and bread. Fumiko's stomach clenched with hunger she had been ignoring. They filed through a line where mess attendants loaded trays without speaking, without judgment, with the mechanical efficiency of men who had done this task 10,000 times. The attendant who served Fumiko was a middle-aged black man with graying hair and kind eyes. He smiled at her. A small smile, brief but genuine, then loaded her tray. Fumiko carried it to a long table and sat, looked at what she had been given. Scrambled eggs, fluffy and yellow and glistening with butter. Real eggs, not the powdered substitute Japan had been using since 1943. The eggs steamed in the cool morning air, releasing smell that made her mouth water. Toast. 2 thick slices of white bread, edges golden and crispy butter, melting into the warm surface. Bacon. 4 strips. The smell hit Fumiko like a memory she had never had, like something primal and overwhelming. Salty, smoky, rich with rendered fat. The strips lay across her plate, fat crisped to transparency at edges, meat tender in the middle. Coffee, black and bitter in a heavy ceramic mug. A bowl of sugar cubes sat in the center of the table. Take as much as you want, no rationing, no measuring. Just help yourself. Fumiko picked up her fork. The metal was cold and heavy and real. She cut into the eggs. They were still warm, almost hot. She took a bite. Butter exploded on her tongue. Salt and richness and the taste of actual protein after months of gruel so thin you could see through it. Her stomach, shrunken from deprivation, barely knew what to do with real food. She chewed slowly. Swallowed, felt warmth spread through her chest. She tried the bacon. The bacon crunched. The sound was audible in the quiet mess hall, crisp and satisfying. Fatty, salty, smoky, the texture both crisp and yielding. The taste was concentrated pleasure, indulgent and overwhelming after so much deprivation. Fumiko had never eaten pork before. Japan did not have bacon. The propaganda had said Americans were barbaric for eating pig, for consuming meat in such quantities for their gluttony and excess. But this tasted like abundance turned into something wonderful. Like a nation that had so much food it could afford to make it delicious instead of merely sustaining. Around the table, women ate in silence. Some cried while they ate, tears running down their faces as they chewed, unable to reconcile the food in their mouths with the starvation they knew was happening back home. Others ate mechanically, faces blank, too overwhelmed to process emotion. Fumiko finished her eggs and bacon and toast, drank the bitter coffee with 3 sugar cubes dissolved into it. Her stomach felt full for the first time in half a year. Full and warm and satisfied in a way that made her want to cry, but she did not cry. She sat very still, hands in her lap, trying to understand what it meant that enemy captivity felt safer and more nourishing than serving her own military had felt. After breakfast came work assignments. An officer speaking through a Japanese-American translator recalled names from a list. Women were assigned to various duties: kitchen work, laundry, cleaning, clerical tasks. The translator was a young man in American uniform, perhaps 25, with features that marked him as Japanese but accent that was purely American. His name was Corporal David Tanaka, born in California, American citizen, fighting for America against the country of his grandparents. The contradictions made Fumiko's head hurt. When Tanaka called her name, Fumiko stood. Administration building, he said in Japanese. Clerical work, filing, sorting papers. Your supervisor speaks no Japanese. You will learn English fast. Fumiko nodded. Her English was minimal. School English, never used, mostly forgotten. She could read Roman letters, stumble through basic phrases. But conversation was beyond her. The administration building sat at the center of camp. 2 stories, red brick American flag hanging from pole out front. Fumiko walked there alone, following directions Tanaka had given. Guards watched her pass, but did not interfere. Did not grab or threaten or leer. Just watched bored, waiting for their shifts to end. Inside the building smelled of paper and typewriter ribbon and coffee. Linoleum floors gleamed under fluorescent lights. Somewhere a typewriter clacked steadily. A telephone rang and stopped. A woman waited in a small office on the first floor. She stood when Fumiko entered, extended her hand. Hello, she said slowly, speaking English with exaggerated care. You, Fumiko, I'm Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson was perhaps 48 years old, though Fumiko was bad at estimating American ages. Gray hair pinned in a neat bun at the base of her skull. Simple blue dress with white collar. No makeup except a touch of lipstick. She wore a small gold star pin on her collar, right side positioned precisely. Fumiko did not know what the pin meant. Would not learn for weeks. But later, when she understood, it would break something inside her and rebuild it differently. Fumiko stared at Mrs. Patterson's extended hand. In Japan, you bowed. You did not touch, especially did not touch superiors, especially did not touch as equals. But this was America, and Mrs. Patterson was waiting, hand extended, patient, expecting Fumiko to meet her halfway. Fumiko shook her hand. Mrs. Patterson's grip was warm and firm and brief. Working hands rough with calluses. Welcome, Mrs. Patterson said. She smiled. Small smile, careful but genuine. We work together. I teach. You learn. Okay. Fumiko understood perhaps half the words, but all of the meaning. She nodded. The work was simple but required attention. Filing papers alphabetically, stamping documents with received dates, learning the American filing system, which was different from Japanese systems, in ways that seemed arbitrary until Fumiko learned the logic behind them. Operating a typewriter, which Fumiko had used before in radio operations training. The typewriter here was better quality than Japanese military equipment, keys smooth and responsive. Mrs. Patterson taught through gestures and drawings and patience. When Fumiko made mistakes, and she made many those first days, Mrs. Patterson simply corrected them and moved on. No anger, no contempt, no raised voice or impatience. She treated Fumiko like a person learning a job. Nothing more, nothing less. By the end of the first week, Fumiko had learned perhaps 50 new English words, basic words, file, paper, stamp, date, yes, no, please, thank you, good morning. The words felt strange in her mouth, angular and abrupt compared to Japanese, but they worked, they communicated, they built small bridges. Mrs. Patterson learned a few Japanese words too. Hello, thank you, good work. Her pronunciation was terrible, vowels all wrong, but the effort mattered more than accuracy. They worked together in comfortable silence most days. The office was quiet, peaceful. Outside the windows, Fumiko could see other prisoners moving between buildings, guards on patrol, the ordinary rhythms of military life. But here inside this small office, filing papers and drinking coffee, Fumiko felt something she had not felt since before the war. She felt almost normal. The other women adapted in their own ways. Hana, the 23-year-old nurse, worked in the camp infirmary under American medical staff. She had seen horrors in Japanese field hospitals that still woke her screaming, had watched her younger brother die at Saipan at 17 years old, his last letter saying he would fight to the death rather than surrender with honor. Now she watched American doctors treat Japanese prisoners with the same care they gave American soldiers. Watch them work to save lives without regard for whose uniform the patient had worn. Watch them teach her medical techniques. Japan had never bothered showing female nurses because women were not supposed to understand complex procedures. The chief surgeon was Captain Robert Morrison, 34 years old, from somewhere called Ohio. He had shown Hannah how to use a blood pressure cuff properly, how to read the gauge, how to record results, had taught her English medical terminology, had praised her suturing technique, saying through Corporal Tanaka, "You have good hands, steady, you should be a doctor someday." Hannah wanted to hate him, wanted to believe this was strategy, manipulation, Americans softening prisoners for interrogation. But Dr. Morrison had worked a 14-hour shift last week saving a male Japanese prisoner who had developed appendicitis, had saved him the same way he would save an American soldier, had stood in the operating room, hands covered in blood, and simply done his job. When Tanaka asked Morrison later why he had tried so hard for an enemy prisoner, Morrison said, "I took an oath. Do no harm. Does not say accept prisoners. Does not say accept enemies. Just says do no harm." Hana lay awake nights trying to reconcile this with everything she knew about war and enemies and the nature of conflict. Could not reconcile it. The pieces did not fit. So she simply filed the experience away, let it sit unexamined, and kept learning medicine from a man who should have been her enemy, but acted more like a teacher. Keiko, the 17-year-old farm girl from Hokkaido, worked in the mess hall kitchen under supervision of the head cook. His name was Luther Washington, a large black man from somewhere called Alabama, with a voice that rumbled like distant thunder and laugh that could fill entire rooms. Luther spoke no Japanese. Keiko spoke perhaps 50 words of English, gained slowly through immersion and necessity. But somehow they communicated. Luther taught through demonstration, showed her how to make cornbread, the southern staple made from cornmeal and milk and eggs, baked until golden and crumbly. Showed her the right ratio of ingredients, the way buttermilk made it tender, the honey drizzle on top that elevated it from good to perfect. Keiko learned by watching and doing, made mistakes, burned batches, used too much salt or not enough. Luther corrected without criticism, just showed her again patient and thorough. Yesterday, Luther had let her taste molasses straight from the jar. The sweetness had made Keiko gasp, overwhelmed by sugar in its most concentrated form. Luther had laughed deep and warm and said something Keiko did not understand but felt in her bones. "Welcome, you belong here. You are safe." At night back in the barracks, Keiko tried to explain to other women what it felt like to cook alongside the enemy, to laugh with them, to share food and technique in the universal language of kitchen work. Some women called her a collaborator, said she was forgetting who she was, forgetting Japan, betraying the memory of everyone who had died. But Keiko thought privately that maybe she was not forgetting who she was. Maybe she was remembering who she could be if war had not twisted everything into shapes that fit no one. Sachiko, the 28-year-old school teacher from Tokyo, worked in the camp library. It was a small building, maybe 500 books, mostly military field manuals and regulations, but also some novels and newspapers and magazines. Before the war, Sachiko had taught elementary school, had stood in front of classrooms and taught children what the government told her to teach, that Americans were demons, that Japan was divine chosen superior, that victory was inevitable and death in service was the highest honor. She had believed it when she taught it, had never questioned. Why would she? The government said it. Teachers said it. Everyone said it. It must be true. Now she sat in the camp library reading American newspapers from the stack near the window. The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, articles about the war in Europe ending in May, about Germany's surrender, about concentration camps being liberated and the horrors discovered there, about American forces island hopping across the Pacific, about B-29 bombers firebombing Japanese cities. She read about American democracy, about freedom of speech and press and assembly, about elections where citizens chose their leaders and could vote them out if displeased, about courts that protected individual rights even against government power. She read about American industrial capacity, Liberty ships built in weeks instead of months, tanks rolling off assembly lines by the thousands, the casual mention of resources that suggested abundance beyond anything Japan had ever possessed. And she realized with sick certainty that everything she had taught children was lies, not mistakes, not misunderstandings. Deliberate lies designed to make children believe death was honor and America was evil and victory was possible when victory had never been possible. How many children had died believing her lies? How many young men had charged American machine guns thinking they were divine and bullets could not touch the righteous? How many had taken cyanide capsules rather than surrender, trusting what their teachers had told them? Sachiko sat in that library afternoon, sun streaming through windows, surrounded by truth she had never been allowed to see, and felt the weight of complicity settle on her shoulders. She had not known, but not knowing did not erase what she had done. So she read, consumed every newspaper and magazine she could find, learned English faster than anyone else because she needed to know. Needed to understand how thoroughly they had all been lied to. Needed to figure out what came next. At night, she wrote in a diary she kept hidden beneath her mattress. Wrote everything. The food, the kindness, the lies Japan had told. The truth she was discovering. The guilt that ate at her. The confusion that never ended. She did not know it yet, but that diary would matter. Would save someone's life months from now. Would provide evidence at exactly the moment evidence was needed most. But that was still future. For now, she just wrote and tried to make sense of a world that had revealed itself to be opposite of everything she had believed. By mid-May, divisions were forming among the women. Some, like Keiko, adapted, embraced the situation, learned English eagerly, made friends with American staff. They argued that the war was over for them, that suffering needlessly served no purpose, that survival was not betrayal. Others resisted, clung to Japanese honor codes, viewed adaptation as collaboration, kindness as weakness, acceptance as treason. They whispered that the Americans were manipulating them, softening them, preparing them for something worse. They insisted that maintaining Japanese identity meant maintaining Japanese rigidity, even in captivity. A third group, including Fumiko and Sachiko, stood in the middle, unable to embrace either extreme, processing, questioning, trying to understand what loyalty meant when your country had lied to you and your enemy had shown you mercy. One night in late May, argument erupted in the barracks. Keiko had brought back leftover cornbread from the kitchen wrapped in cloth napkin. She offered it around, smiling, wanting to share something good. A woman named Yuriko slapped it out of her hand. Yuriko was 26, former factory worker husband, killed at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. She had received the notification in January. He had gone down with his ship, one of thousands lost in the largest naval battle in history. She wore his ring on a chain around her neck. "You shame us," Yuriko hissed. Her face was twisted with anger and grief that had nowhere else to go. Eating their food with gratitude, learning their language, smiling at them like they are friends. "Have you forgotten your husband died fighting these people?" Keiko's face crumpled. "I have not forgotten, but he died so I could live. What good does it do his memory if I starve myself out of pride?" Pride, Yuriko stood shaking. "It is not pride, it is honor. It is remembering who we are. We are Japanese. We serve the emperor. We do not make peace with the enemy." Sachiko intervened, voice calm but firm. "The emperor surrendered. When the emperor makes peace with the enemy, what are we supposed to do?" "The war is not over," Yuriko shot back. "Japan has not surrendered. Reports say we are still fighting." "Reports? From where?" Sachiko asked. "We have been in American captivity for 6 weeks. We have no reports. We know nothing about what is happening in Japan." Hana, who had been silent through this exchange, finally spoke. "I believe what you believe. Believe the code was absolute, that honor meant death and survival meant shame. But then I watched an American doctor save a male prisoner's appendix when he could have let him die. Worked 4 hours in surgery for an enemy prisoner." "What does the code say about that?" The barracks fell silent. Fumiko, who had tried to stay out of these arguments, who had tried to simply survive day by day without confronting larger questions, found herself standing. Found words coming that she had not known she needed to say. "I held a cyanide capsule in my hand," she said quietly. Every woman turned to look at her. "I was told to take it, told that death was better than capture, that Americans would do unspeakable things to me." Her voice was steady, calm, but her hands shook. "But I could not make my fingers move. And when the American soldier found me, he gave me water instead of death. On the ship, they gave me bread. Here they give us bacon and hot showers and clean beds. Mrs. Patterson's son died at Iwo Jima, and she teaches me to use a typewriter." She looked around the barracks at women caught between worlds, between identities, between past and future. "I do not know what honor means anymore. I was taught honor meant dying. But what if honor means living? What if honor means accepting kindness even from enemies? What if honor means admitting we were wrong?" Her voice rose not in anger but in anguish. Because we were wrong about everything. America is not being destroyed. American people are not starving. American soldiers are not demons. Everything we were told was lies. All of it. She sat down abruptly, energy draining out of her. The silence stretched. Then Yuriko, voice breaking, asked the question none of them could answer. If we were wrong about everything, what did they die for? What did my husband die for? No one responded because there was no good answer. The dead had died for lies. Had died because their government chose pride over reality, because their military chose war over peace, because their leaders valued empire over lives. But saying that felt like betrayal, felt like declaring their deaths meaningless, and no one wanted to carry that weight. So they sat in silence as Mississippi nights settled around them, each woman alone, with questions that had no answers, guilt that had no resolution, grief that had no outlet. Outside, American soldiers walked patrol. Inside, Japanese women tried to sleep and failed. Tomorrow they would wake and work and eat bacon and learn English and continue existing in the strange liminal space between enemy and human, between prisoner and person, between past and future. And somewhere in offices, they would never see decisions were being made about their fate. June arrived with heat that felt like punishment. Mississippi summer pressed down on Camp Shelby with humidity so thick it turned air into liquid. Fumiko's cotton dress clung to her skin from the moment she stepped outside until the moment she returned to barracks at night. The pine trees shimmered in waves of heat rising from red clay. Even breathing felt like work, but the work itself continued. Fumiko's English improved daily. She could hold basic conversations with Mrs. Patterson now, could read simple documents, could type reports without needing every word translated. The transformation was practical, necessary, but also profound. Language was not just communication. Language was identity, and learning English felt like becoming someone new. One afternoon in late June, working late while rain drummed on the roof and cooled the air for the first time in weeks, Mrs. Patterson made tea. Real tea. Not the bitter ersatz substitute Japan had been drinking since trade embargoes cut off imports. She poured 2 cups at the small table in the corner of the office, handed one to Fumiko. They sat in companionable silence, listening to rain. The office smelled of wet earth and paper and tea. Outside, lightning flickered. Thunder rumbled in the distance, moving closer. Mrs. Patterson touched the gold star pin on her collar. The gesture was unconscious, automatic, like touching a talisman. Fumiko had seen her do it 100 times, had wondered what it meant, but never asked because the question felt too personal, too intrusive. I had a son, Mrs. Patterson said quietly. Her voice was conversational and matter-of-fact, but underneath ran current of grief so deep it had no bottom. James, he was 20 years old. Fumiko's English was good enough now to catch the shift in Mrs. Patterson's voice, the way had replaced has, the finality of was instead of is. James Patterson existed only in memory now. Past tense meant death. He died in February, Mrs. Patterson continued. She stared at her teacup, not looking at Fumiko. Iwo Jima. Do you know Iwo Jima? Fumiko knew Iwo Jima. Everyone in Japan knew Iwo Jima, the island where 20,000 Japanese soldiers had fought to the last man, where Americans had taken horrific casualties capturing 8 square miles of volcanic rock, where the photograph of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi had become symbol of American determination. Yes, Fumiko whispered. I know Iwo Jima. Mrs. Patterson nodded, sipped her tea. James was a private, 20 years old, wrote letters about wanting to come home, wanting to see his girl again, wanting to help rebuild when the war was over. She paused, swallowed. He died on the 3rd day of fighting. Bullet through the chest. Quick, they said. Probably did not suffer long. She touched the pin again. This is a gold star pin. It means my son died in the war. It means I am a gold star mother. There are thousands of us now, tens of thousands, women who will never see our boys again. Fumiko set her teacup down carefully so her shaking hands would not make it rattle. Mrs. Patterson's son had died fighting Japanese forces, had died on an island Japan had defended with suicidal determination, had been killed by someone wearing the same uniform Fumiko had worn, following the same orders, believing the same lies. She waited for the rage, the hatred, the vengeance she knew must be coming. Waited for Mrs. Patterson to stand and strike her and scream that she was the enemy, that she represented everything that had taken James away. But Mrs. Patterson just sat there holding her teacup, looking tired and sad, and somehow still kind. James wrote me his last letter 2 days before he died, she said. I received it 3 weeks after the telegram came telling me he was gone. He wrote about the Japanese soldiers, said they fought hard because They loved their country, said when the war was over, we would need to remember we are all just people who love our countries and our families and want to go home. She looked at Fumiko then, made eye contact. Her eyes were blue and clear and filled with sorrow that had calcified into something harder. Not hate, something else, something like acceptance. That is why I teach you Fumiko, because James would have wanted me to, because he understood something I am still learning, that the enemy is not evil, just human. And once the fighting stops, we have to figure out how to be human together. Fumiko could not speak. Her throat had closed. Her eyes burned. The weight of Mrs. Patterson's grace was crushing, was more devastating than any cruelty could have been. Mrs. Patterson's son was dead because of Japan, and Mrs. Patterson was honoring his memory by teaching English to a Japanese girl, by showing kindness to the people who had killed him, by choosing to build bridges instead of walls. That evening back in the barracks, Fumiko lay in her bunk, unable to explain what had happened. The other women asked why she looked upset. She could not answer, could not find words for the enormity of what Mrs. Patterson had given her. Forgiveness. Mrs. Patterson had not said she forgave anything, had not absolved Jaridin or erased what had been done by women, but she had chosen to see Fumiko as a person rather than a symbol, had chosen to honor her son by being kind to his enemies, had chosen humanity over hatred. And Fumiko understood then that this was what Americans meant when they talked about their values. Not empty words, not propaganda, but choices made in the face of grief, choices that cost something, choices that required sacrifice of the comfortable rage that gave grief purpose. She fell asleep that night, still thinking about James Patterson, 20 years old, who had died believing that even enemies deserved to be seen as human, and about Eleanor Patterson, who was trying to live according to her son's belief, even though it would have been easier, would have hurt less to simply hate. July arrived with news that changed everything. The camp commander made an announcement on July 5th. Japan had not surrendered, but the end was clearly approaching. American forces were preparing for invasion of the Japanese home islands. Estimates suggested casualties would be catastrophic on both sides. Millions would die. And with the end approaching, decisions were being made about prisoners. Male Japanese POWs held at various camps across the United States would be consolidated. Some would be sent to Camp Shelby. Officers and enlisted men, soldiers captured at Guadalcanal in Saipan and Iwo Jima in Okinawa. Men who had fought to the last bullet and surrendered only when unconscious. Men who still believed. The announcement sent ripples of anxiety through the women's compound. Some hoped to find family members among the men, brothers, cousins, husbands they thought were dead. Others dreaded exactly that, dreaded the judgment, dreaded facing men who had maintained the code while they had broken it. Fumiko felt both. Part of her wanted desperately to hear news of her uncle Captain Yamamoto. Was he alive? Had he been captured, or had he died fighting? She did not know, had no way to know. But another part of her dreaded seeing any Japanese officer again, dreaded hearing the condemnation she knew would come. You survived when you should have died. You accepted enemy kindness when you should have maintained dignity through refusal. You learned their language and ate their food and betrayed everything. The men arrived on August 15th, 6 army trucks, canvas-covered armed guards. The women were told to stay in their barracks during the transfer, but they watched through gaps in the walls, through windows, curiosity and dread overcoming caution. Male voices shouting in Japanese. Command's responses, the crisp efficiency of military discipline, even in defeat. Fumiko pressed her face to a gap between boards and saw them. Men in prisoner uniforms. Heads shaved per regulation. Faces gaunt from captivity and war, but still fierce. Even surrendered, even defeated, even thousands of miles from Japan, they carried themselves like soldiers. Back straight, eyes forward. Pride maintained despite circumstances. One man in particular caught her attention. He walked near the front of the formation, perhaps 32 years old, face carved from stone, all sharp angles and rigid certainty, posture perfect despite whatever hardships had brought him here, eyes scanning the compound with tactical assessment that never stopped, never rested. He looked at the women's barracks, made direct eye contact with Fumiko through the gap in the boards. His expression said everything without words. Judgment, disgust, shame. You are alive when you should be dead. You are here when you should have had the honors to refuse. Fumiko pulled back from the wall, heart hammering. That look had stripped away 3 months of safety and returned her instantly to the moment on Okinawa when her uncle had placed the capsule in her palm. The moment when death was expected and life was betrayal. That night, the women gathered in the barracks and spoke in hushed voices about what would happen next. about whether the men would try to contact them, whether American guards would allow it, whether confrontation was inevitable or could be avoided. Yuriko said what they were all thinking. They will judge us. The officers will see we did not take the capsules. Will see we are eating with Americans learning English. They will know we are disgraced. No one disagreed, because it was true. By the standards they had all been raised with, by the code that defined honor and duty, they were disgraced. They had chosen survival, had chosen life over death, had chosen to accept enemy kindness instead of maintaining rigid purity through refusal. And Japanese officers who had maintained the code, even in captivity, would not understand, could not understand, would not want to understand. For 2 days, the groups remained separated, men in their compound, women in theirs. American guards made clear that interaction was not permitted. Different work details, different meal times, different everything. But everyone knew it could not last. On August 17th, Colonel Bradford made an announcement through Corporal Tanaka. With Japan's surrender approaching with hostilities clearly ending, there was no reason to maintain strict separation between male and female prisoners. They would be allowed to gather for certain activities, religious services, educational programs, work details that required more hands. Starting Sunday, there would be Catholic Mass in the main courtyard. All prisoners invited. Attendance optional, but encouraged. The announcement hit the women's barracks like artillery shell. We should not go, Yuriko said immediately. The officers will use it to reassert control, to remind us of our shame. Sachiko disagreed. If we hide, we look guilty. We survived. That is not a crime no matter what they say. It is a crime to them, Hana said quietly. She had been mostly silent since the men arrived. To Japanese military officers, surrender is the ultimate crime. They will not see us as survivors. They will see us as cowards who chose dishonor. Keiko, voice small and frightened, asked. Ishikawa took another step forward. You will be held accountable. Perhaps not today. Perhaps not here. But when you return to Japan, when you face those who maintained honor, you will answer for your cowardice. And then Sergeant Thomas Webb moved. He stepped between Ishikawa and the women, planted himself directly in the officer's path. 6'2" of Georgia farm boy, who had spent 3 years fighting Japanese forces across islands, whose names he could barely pronounce, who had watched friends die, who had learned to hate efficiently and thoroughly. 4 other American guards moved with him. They formed a line, a barrier. Rifles angled across their chests, not aimed, not threatening, but immovable. Webb spoke in English first. That's far enough, Lieutenant. Then in the broken Japanese Corporal Tanaka had been teaching him. The Japanese he had practiced specifically for moments like this. Dame Hikama-san, no, you cannot go. The courtyard fell silent. Even the screaming stopped. Everyone, American and Japanese male and female, froze in shock at what was happening. Americans were protecting Japanese women from Japanese officers. The enemy was shielding them from their own people. Ishikawa stared at Webb. Confusion flickered across his face, then rage, then something like comprehension. He barked orders in Japanese that Webb did not understand, but whose meaning was obvious. Step aside. This is not your concern. These women are ours to judge. Webb did not move. Behind him, he could hear women crying, could feel their fear like a physical presence. And he thought about his sister Grace, 22 years old, Navy nurse on a hospital ship the Japanese had torpedoed in 1943. Grace, who had written letters about treating wounded Japanese soldiers with the same care she gave Americans. Grace, who had died believing that people were people even when countries were at war. Grace would want him to protect these women, even though they were Japanese, even though Grace had died fighting them, especially because of that. More officers joined Ishikawa, shouting demands that the guards step aside, insisting this was internal Japanese military business, that Americans had no authority over honor codes. Colonel Bradford arrived at a run. He had been in his office when the duty officer reported situation in the courtyard. Now he stood surveying the scene with a cold assessment of a man who had commanded troops through 3 years of war. Sergeant Webb, report. Webb kept his eyes on Ishikawa. Sir, Lieutenant Ishikawa was threatening the female prisoners. We intervened to prevent escalation. Bradford turned to Ishikawa, spoke through Corporal Tanaka, who had appeared beside him. Lieutenant Ishikawa, explain yourself. Through Tanaka, Ishikawa responded. These women violated Japanese military code. I was administering discipline. Discipline. Bradford's voice went cold as winter steel. Let me clarify something for you, Lieutenant. In this camp, there is one authority, American military authority. You are a prisoner of war. These women are prisoners of war. There is no Japanese military hierarchy here. Is that absolutely clear? Ishikawa's face twisted. Shock and humiliation and fury warring for dominance. These women are disgraced. They must answer for choosing survival over honor. They must face consequences for their cowardice. Bradford stepped forward, matched Ishikawa's intensity with authority that came from knowing he held all the power in this moment. These women are under American protection. You will not approach them. You will not threaten them. You will not enforce any code that demands their death or degradation. American law protects all prisoners from harm, including from each other. If you attempt to contact these women again, you will be placed in solitary confinement. Do you understand? The translation hung in the air. Ishikawa stood rigid. His entire worldview, the framework that gave his life meaning, the code he had been willing to die for had just been declared irrelevant by enemy authority. Everything he believed, everything he had built his identity on meant nothing here. His face showed it all. Rage, yes, but also grief. The look of a man watching his certainty shatter. Watching the world reveal itself to be different from what he had always believed it must be. At Bradford's signal, military police stepped forward. Escort Lieutenant Ishikawa and these officers back to their compound. Separate formations from now on. Separate work details. Separate recreation. No contact with female prisoners. As the MPs moved in, Ishikawa made one last gesture. His eyes swept across the women one final time. Landed on Fumiko. In that look, she saw everything. Hatred for what she represented. Grief for what had been lost. And something broken, something that said, if you were right to survive, then I was wrong to want to die, and I cannot accept that because it means everything I believed was a lie. Then he turned and walked away, shoulders rigid with barely contained fury, flanked by MPs who would ensure he never spoke to the women again. The courtyard slowly emptied, male prisoners escorted to their compound, guards returning to posts. Father McKenna gathering his altar materials, with the resigned expression of a man who had seen human conflict too many times to be surprised by it anymore. The women stood in a cluster, trembling, unable to process what had just happened. Sergeant Webb approached Fumiko. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. You okay, miss? His voice was gentle. Fumiko looked up at him. This American soldier who had every reason to hate her, whose sister had died fighting her people, who had just stepped between her and her own commanding officer and declared that she deserved protection. She tried to speak in English. You protect us. Why, Quest? Webb's expression softened. Because it was the right thing to do. But your sister, we Japanese, we killed her. You did not kill her. Webb's voice was firm but kind. A submarine killed her. A war killed her. Hate killed her. But you are just a 19-year-old girl who wanted to live. And there is nothing wrong with that. Fumiko could not respond. Just stood there crying while this man, this enemy who had lost family to her people, told her that survival was not a crime, that choosing life was not betrayal, that she deserved dignity even though she had broken every code she had been taught. The women returned to their barracks in silence. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. They had just witnessed Americans protecting them from their own commanders, had watched enemy soldiers enforce rules that said even prisoners deserve safety, had seen their old world collide with the new reality and watch the old world lose. That night, lying in her bunk, they will not see us as survivors. They will see us as cowards who chose dishonor. Keiko, voice small and frightened, asked what they were all thinking. What if my brothers aren't among them? What if they are ashamed of me? Fumiko lay in her bunk, listening to the argument circle without resolution. Finally, she spoke. I am going, she said, not loudly, not with certainty, but with tired determination. Not because I want to, because I need to face it. Need to know what they will say. Need to stop running from judgment. Around the barracks, slow, reluctant nods. Agreements born of necessity rather than courage. They would go to mass, would face their commanders, would accept whatever came next because hiding was just another form of shame. That night, Fumiko barely slept, lay awake staring at ceiling, listening to other women breathe and shift and whisper. Tomorrow they would see Japanese officers again. Tomorrow the code they had broken would be spoken aloud. Tomorrow they would have to answer for choosing life. And Fumiko had no idea what she would say. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of bright, cruel sunlight that seemed to mock fear. Fumiko dressed carefully in her cleanest prison dress, combed her hair until it shone, as if looking presentable could somehow protect her from what was coming. The women walked to the courtyard in a cluster, protective formation, drawing strength from proximity even though none of them felt strong. The courtyard was large, packed dirt surrounded by barracks on three sides. A makeshift altar had been set up at one end. Father McKenna, the camp chaplain, stood behind it in his vestments. He was an old man, perhaps 60, who had served in the First War and carried himself with the gentle weariness of someone who had seen too much death to judge anyone harshly. The men were already there, standing in neat formation on the far side of the courtyard, officers in front, enlisted men behind. 50 feet of empty space separated the two groups, and along the perimeter, American guards. Sergeant Webb and his squad positioned nearest the women. Webb stood with his rifle held at ease, expression neutral, but Fumiko noticed his eyes constantly scanning the male prisoners. Watching, assessing, ready. Father McKenna began the service, spoke about reconciliation and forgiveness and peace. His words were translated by Corporal Tanaka in a voice that carried no emotion, just technical accuracy. Fumiko heard none of it. Her entire focus was on the officers across the courtyard, on the man she had seen through the gap in the boards. He stood 3 rows back, eyes fixed on the women with intensity that felt physical. Waiting. The mass lasted 30 minutes. Father McKenna gave communion, which few of the prisoners took, then spoke a blessing and dismissed them. The groups were supposed to separate, return to their respective compounds, resume the division that kept them from confronting each other. But as the women turned to leave, as they began moving toward the barracks, the officer stepped forward. His voice cut across the courtyard like a blade. Sharp, commanding, absolute. Women of the Imperial Army, stand at attention. The command was in Japanese, perfect formal Japanese. The language of orders that must be obeyed without question or thought. And without thinking, trained by years of military discipline, conditioned by cultural forces older than the war, some women snapped to attention. Bodies remembering before minds could protest. Spines straightening, hands going to sides, eyes forward. Others froze confused, caught between obedience and fear. Fumiko stood paralyzed. Her body wanted to obey, remembered how to obey, but her mind screamed warnings. This was a trap. This was the moment they had been dreading. This was judgment arriving with military precision. The officer began walking toward them. 2 other officers flanked him. 3 men in prisoner uniforms that did nothing to diminish their authority. Authority built over decades of military service. Authority that said officers command and subordinates obey, and that is the natural order of things. 20 feet away. 15. His face was rigid with controlled fury and absolute certainty. He was not cruel, not sadistic. He genuinely believed what he was about to say, believed it with religious fervor, believed it was necessary and right and required by honor. 10 feet. He stopped, looked at each woman individually. Let his gaze linger. Let them feel the weight of his judgment. Then he spoke. You stand before me in disgrace. His voice was formal, military, the voice of a commander addressing troops who had failed in their duty. You were given sacred duty. You wore the uniform of the Imperial Japanese Army. You were told that death was preferable to capture. You were given the means to preserve your honor. He paused, let the words land. But you refused. You chose life over dignity. You chose surrender over duty. You chose existence over meaning. Around Fumiko, women began to tremble. Some started crying. The words hit like physical blows because they were true by the standards they had been raised with. They had chosen life, had chosen surrender, had chosen existence, and in doing so had violated everything they had been taught honor meant. The officer's eyes swept across them again, this time landing on specific individuals. On Keiko. You wear American clothes, cook American food, smile at the enemy who killed your countrymen. On Hana. You work in their hospitals, tend their sick, serve those who slaughtered your brother. On Sachiko. You read their books, learn their language, absorb their propaganda as if it were truth. On Fumiko. He stared at her. Recognition flashed in his eyes. He knew her. Somehow impossibly he knew her. You, he said. His voice dropped, became personal instead of general. Radio operator Tanaka, I gave you that capsule myself, placed it in your hand, looked you in the eye, told you what honor demanded. Fumiko's vision narrowed. The world reduced to this man's face and the memory crashing over her. Okinawa, the bunker, her uncle distributing capsules, and beside him his second in command. This man, Lieutenant Takeshi Ishikawa, he had been there, had watched her take the capsule, had expected her to use it. I told you death was better than shame, Ishikawa continued, but here you stand, alive, fed, clean, comfortable, while your brothers died on beaches, while your mothers starve at home, while Japan burns. His voice rose in intensity without increasing volume. You were told Americans were demons, but you found them kind, did you not? They gave you food and hot water and soft beds, And you were so weak, so pathetically weak, that you accepted it. You let kindness seduce you into betraying everything. Around Fumiko, the screaming started, not from one woman, but from many, erupting like contagion, high-pitched and desperate and primal, because they understood what Ishikawa was not saying directly. What he did not need to say, because they all knew. He was here to enforce the code. Even now, even in America, even after everything, the code that said you should have died, women dropped to their knees, clutched each other. Some curled into themselves as if they could disappear. The scream guards, the declaration that she was under protection, and she understood something that would shape the rest of her life. Sometimes humanity comes from where you least expect it. Sometimes the people you are told to fear are the ones who teach you the most important lessons. Sometimes mercy is stronger than hate, and kindness is braver than cruelty. Outside the barracks, Mississippi night settled cool and quiet. Tomorrow would bring new routines, but everything had changed. Because today she had learned that American values were not propaganda. They were real. They were practiced. They were defended even when it would have been easier to look away. And that was more devastating and more hopeful than any weapon could ever be. The months that followed passed in a blur of changing seasons and changing hearts. Christmas 1945 brought the first snow Mississippi had seen in years. The mess hall smelled of pine and cinnamon and roasted turkey. Fumiko tasted apple pie for the first time, the sweet tartness of American abundance baked into flaky crust. Mrs. Patterson had made it herself, brought it to the camp, wrapped in clean cloth. They ate together in the administration office, two women who should have been enemies sharing dessert in comfortable silence. "You will do well when you go home," Mrs. Patterson said. "Your English is perfect now." Fumiko touched the dictionary Mrs. Patterson had given her, always kept close. "I will miss you. And I will miss you, but this is not goodbye. This is just distance." In spring 1946, the orders came. Repatriation. The women would return to Japan. Sergeant Webb supervised the departure. He shook Fumiko's hand one last time. "You take care of yourself, miss. Remember what you learned here." "I will remember everything," Fumiko promised, "especially that enemies are just friends we have not met yet." The ship that carried them back crossed the same Pacific waters, but nothing was the same. The women who had boarded as terrified prisoners now returned as something else. Changed. Awakened. Carrying truth that would reshape their lives. Tokyo Harbor was devastated. The city Fumiko remembered existed only in ruins. Her mother waited at the processing center, thin and aged but alive. They embraced without words, holding each other as if they could merge into one person who had survived when so many had not. On the train to what remained of Hiroshima, her mother asked the question that mattered. What was it like in America? Fumiko thought of bacon and lavender soap and hot showers. Of Mrs. Patterson's Gold Star pin and Sergeant Webb's protection. Of the moment Americans had stood between her and her own commanders and declared that even enemies deserved dignity. "They treated us like human beings," she said simply. "When we expected demons, they showed us humanity." 5 years later, working as a translator in Tokyo, helping Japanese civilians navigate American occupation, Fumiko received a letter from Mississippi. Mrs. Patterson's handwriting, familiar and warm. "Dear Fumiko, I hope this letter finds you well. I think of you often. The war took my son, but it gave me you a reminder that even in darkness, there is light." Fumiko sat at her desk, photograph of Camp Shelby on the wall behind her, and wrote her response. "Dear Eleanor, you asked if I remember the woman who could not speak English. I remember. She was terrified and certain she was speaking to an enemy. She was wrong about that last part. Thank you for teaching me that survival is not shame, that dignity is not found in death, and that the bravest thing we can do is choose to live and rebuild. Your friend across the ocean, Fumiko." She sealed the envelope and looked out at Tokyo rising from ruins. Sometimes humanity comes from where you least expect it. Sometimes mercy is stronger than hatred. Sometimes the people you are told to fear teach you what it truly means to be human. The war had ended, but the lesson remained, and Fumiko would carry it until the day she died.